I think we're going to have a conversation between Lydia and me for about 40 or 45 minutes, and then to open it up to all of you, so because you will have questions as well for Lydia. As you heard, our honoured guest is somebody with direct experience of the Shoah, a survivor of Terezin and Auschwitz. Also, we are going to be speaking about Lydia's work after the 1945, the life she made, the work she made, and some reflections also on how we think about this subject and how we think about the people who went through it. So that's how we're going to do it. Lydia, it's a great honor for me to speak with you. The first thing I want to ask, which comes to mind because I just last month interviewed Ivor Pearl, who is a survivor of Auschwitz. Mm-hmm. And he admitted to me that before he goes to something like this, before he speaks at a school or before doing an interview with me, there is something which is somewhere between nerves about doing it and a kind of dread about having to do it. He feels he has to do it, but so it's an odd thing for me to begin this, but on some level, are you slightly dreading having to have this conversation?
Not at all. I'm used to it.
So let's think, in that case, I'm glad about that, relieved. Let's get right into it. You're from what was then Czechoslovakia,
yes.
But somehow, on the first day that war broke out, in the beginning of September of 1939, you were not in Czechoslovakia, you were in Poland, which was not an easy place to be on that day in September 1939. You were stuck in Krakow.
That's right.
Just tell us how come.
How come? My father managed to get to England via Poland before the war. We were supposed to follow him. Unfortunately, by the time we left, we got to Krakow a week before the war broke out, and we were no longer able to leave. We did, in fact, have to get to Poland illegally, and at the border we were threatened by a Polish guard. Unless we went back, he'd shoot us, so we had to find another way. And in the end, it was the German border guard who got us safely across into Poland. We stayed with some would-be relatives in Krakow in a very newly built block of flats, and opposite the landing was the flat of Anne Karp's mother, who was a well-known pianist. Most of the Jews, when the Germans invaded Poland, most of the Jews fled east, including Anne Karp's mother and the people in whose flat we lived. And one day, the maid, the Polish maid who was left behind, came to my mother in desperation. Mrs. Volkart, I've got 5 German officers, and I can't speak German. So at the tender age of 10, I became an interpreter for the German officers. I must actually point out that the difference between the German officers, the army generally, and the Luftwaffe and the SS was really incredible. I mean, they behaved like human beings. We actually had a Luftwaffe officer billeted in our flat, and when he found out that my mother got up at 3 in the morning to queue for bread, he gave us some bread. So I'm just pointing out the difference in their behavior.
So at this point, you're 10 years old.
Right.
You speak, I presume, Czech and Slovak because of...
Well, Slovak and Czech are fairly similar.
Yeah.
I kind of picked up a bit of Polish.
A bit of Polish and enough German that you could act as the interpreter.
Yeah, German I knew. I was bilingual from early on, yeah.
Yeah. But you were, in effect, sort of marooned in Poland because, as you say, your father had gone ahead en route to England. You were in Poland in order to follow him, and the outbreak of war prevented that. you didn't stay there. I mean, eventually you were to go back into
Yes,
Czechoslovakia.
illegally we managed to get back.
But that also at that point was effectively had been occupied, taken by the Nazis.
Yes.
What was? I mean, obviously Poland wasn't a great place to be, but I'm just trying to work out the thinking of going back into Czechoslovakia at that point. Why was that what the family decided to do?
Well, partly because the rest of the family, my aunts and uncle, were in the Czech Republic, and because it felt safer to be there than to be in Poland, which was a foreign country to us.
And at that point, I'm wondering to what extent you understood. I mean, you make this really interesting point about German military not being the terrifying figures that you would, of course, encounter later in the form of the SS. But I'm wondering then, September 1939 and later, what sense you had of the danger you were in as Jews? What awareness, you were 10 years old, what awareness did you have of that?
I really don't know how to answer it. I can't remember. Certainly the adults were all very anxious, and somehow we must have picked it up that, we were in some kind of danger, but it was sort of nebulous. We didn't really know. I mean, we knew that people, the thing started very slowly. First you had to hand in your radios, then you were not allowed to go out after 8 o'clock in the evening. Then we had to start wearing the yellow star, and you weren't allowed to go into certain shops. You weren't allowed to be in school other than in a Jewish school, which I happened to be in anyway before the war. So there were these kind of gradual restrictions that were imposed on us.
And did you have any sense, and again, I take what you say about not knowing, but did you have any sense of why Jews were at the receiving end of this treatment? You're 10 years old. I'm wondering how a 10-year-old child makes sense of that.
I don't know. I think, I suppose somewhere we were aware of anti-Semitism. It was always in the air a bit. Although I must say I don't remember experiencing it personally. Well, that comes much later, but in a way, what Hitler succeeded in doing is confirming me in my Jewish identity.
That's something you hear a lot. You're back in Czechoslovakia at that point.
Yeah.
And it's your mother and your sister and you.
Yes.
But I think you end up in an orphanage.
That's right,
And
yes.
again, how does that happen?
Well, that happened because when we got back to Ostrava, my mother had no means of supporting us. And I think through the Jewish community, I was offered a place in what was the Jewish orphanage in Prague. In fact, it was partly an orphanage, and partly there were girls like myself where either the father or the mother were no longer alive or available, so we lived there. And it was really, to call it an orphanage makes it sound sort of dire and dismal. It was a very enlightened children's home. And interestingly enough, the director of the children's home had trained with Anna Freud in Vienna. So
that is interesting, given where your life will go after the war. So we'll store up that fact, because that's sort of a premonition of what will come later.
But then her fate was rather tragic, because she had the distinction of taking 300 children who had arrived in Terezin from probably Sobibor or somewhere to take them to Auschwitz, to the gas chambers. So that was her fate in the end, yeah.
And she went with those children.
She went with those children, yes.
You, I think, have said that in the orphanage, you weren't the only one to be not an orphan.
That's
there were
right.
other children there who were, as you
yes.
say, so it was like a children's home. And it's amazing, I think, to people now to think that there was a functioning Jewish orphanage in Prague or in Czechoslovakia, even when it's now overrun. It's now in the control of the fascists. I mean, that they were allowing a Jewish institution still to function. Explain that.
Well, I can't. I can't explain it. I think it closed shortly. Well, because I think in 41, towns were systematically evacuated to the Jewish population to Terezin. Yeah. I don't know. Some of the people from Prague actually went to Lodz already. Ostrava, when I returned home in 42, Ostrava was evacuated in September 42. So we went to Terezin in September 42.
Yeah. And so Terezin is a really, in the kind of accounts of the Holocaust, Terezin is in a category almost of its own, because it's an odd place, isn't it? As I wanted you to explain, but it's people describe it sometimes partly a camp, partly a ghetto, partly something else. Well, but you tell us what it was.
It was actually described as, it was called Ghetto Theresienstadt. And it was a ghetto. It wasn't an extermination camp. There was the small fortress next door to Terezin with political prisoners who were executed. But Terezin itself was a transit camp, because most people who arrived in Terezin were shipped off to Sobibor and Majdanek and subsequently Auschwitz. Yeah.
And the reason why I think it's well known is because there was also this life in Terezin.
Well, I described it as the paradox.
Yeah.
We were hungry, we were locked up, we were prisoners, but I actually encountered culture for the first time in Terezin. I heard Verdi's Requiem there at the age of 11. Never would have done in Ostrava. I heard the Kreutzer Sonata, La Bohème, and there was a very, I think the Germans quite deliberately allowed this cultural life to flourish, and since all of the Jewish intelligentsia and artists and performers, singers, composers were also incarcerated, they created this cultural life.
And what, you said you think that the Germans allowed that to happen.
Yes.
What's your reading of why they allowed it to happen?
I think because in some ways, I mean, there was this visit from the Red Cross later, in some ways it was meant to be a kind of example of a nice camp, of a good, how well the Germans treated the Jews. As I say, because most people didn't stay there very long.
No, that's right. It was the notion of it as a sort of showpiece camp, so that if Red Cross inspectors wanted to see.
And it was a self-administration. I mean, it was administered by the Jews themselves.
And did you, I mean, you were very young, but did you ever have any encounter with the leadership, the Jews who were in charge? Do you remember seeing them?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we were very lucky to have survived so long in Terezin, and because most of the people, most of my family, aunts, uncles, were shipped to Majdanek and Sobibor almost immediately. But we were under the protection of the medical officer who happened to be a nephew or cousin or uncle of one of my uncles. And he protected us because my mother worked as a nurse, sort of nurse, looking after old people. So that protected us from the transports.
And how long, you said how long you'd survived, just tell us how
2
long.
2 years we were in Terezin, from September 42 to October 44.
Yeah, which is, as you say, anyway a long time, but particularly in terms of Terezin. And in terms of where you were living, again, because Terezin is in this odd in-between category, in a ghetto people would live in what had been houses, private homes, that were then, as it were, taken over.
Theresienstadt, of course, was a camp, a town for, it had a lot of barracks because it was a
garrison town.
It was a garrison town, thank you. And so you could accommodate a lot of people. When we first arrived, we lived in the Dresdner Kaserne, and there were about 30 of us in one room on three-story bunks. So it could accommodate a lot of people. Later on, I moved to a children's home, which again had about 30 people. But that was a bit more, we had the person who looked after us tried to give us some education, so she would get up at 6 in the morning with us in order to give us some lessons before we went to work.
Yeah. Because you mentioned the work your mother was doing. What work were you made to do?
I was working in the garden, in the market gardens outside Terezin, where we grew cucumbers and tomatoes for the Germans.
And slave labor, actually.
Yes.
Yeah. And did you have enough to eat? I mean, were you...
Not enough. Well, one was always somewhat hungry. We had 3 meals a day. We had breakfast, I think a slice of bread and what was paraded as coffee. Lunchtime was usually barley soup with a few bits of horse meat. And
horse meat, you said?
Yeah, I think it was horse meat, yes. And the evening, I think it was the same or something similar. So we were fed to be kept alive, but not to feel really full, yeah.
And you were 13, 14 years old?
I was there from 12, yes, yeah.
And so this is a time when you should have been growing physically. Instead, you are working from early till late, and only given enough to just meet the sort of threshold of nutrition, just enough to survive, but not to thrive. And you were able, though, to remain a family, the 3 of you at that point.
Until then, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then there is this, and then these cultural activities you mentioned, and in a way some of what we're doing today is going to touch on the sort of extraordinary cultural output there was. When did that happen? So you've worked all day, you've barely got enough to eat. So in the evenings you had the energy to listen to Verdi or Mozart?
Maybe it must have been the weekends, because we didn't work. I don't think we worked at the weekends, yes.
And where would that happen? Where would the recitals
happen? I was just trying to remember where. I mean, usually things happened in the attics of various houses, but there must have been a bigger hall for something. Yeah. I mean, when I say Verdi, it was only a choral version. There was no orchestra.
And the performers were themselves inmates of Terezin, obviously.
Of course, yes.
And just, again, so people have a picture of it, we know that in other camps that were not showpiece camps designed for the visits of the Red Cross, people wore those notorious uniforms, the striped uniforms. Were you wearing civilian clothes? Normal clothes?
My own clothes, yes.
Although they got pretty ragged.
I think we were allowed to take 50 kilo of possessions to Terezin,
And you was, as you explained, sleeping on those sort of 3-tiered bunks that were extremely basic. Now, at some point, your mother and sister get sent somewhere else. And
that's right, yes.
And I want you to tell us where they were sent and how it came to be that you were going to join them.
Well, they were when transports regularly went to, as I say, to these camps, people got a piece of paper to say, you are to come to this and this place at this and this time. And my mother, in fact, I only discovered after the war that the only person who got this was my sister. My mother volunteered to go with her. They were already, they were sent to Auschwitz, and I decided that I really, we knew and didn't know where we were going. And as I discovered later when I studied psychoanalysis, one's defense mechanisms work so well that you can actually deny what you're seeing, the reality that you're seeing. So people denied gas chambers, even though it was known that they existed. I decided that I wanted to be with them, so I volunteered, but I wasn't allowed. I arrived there at this, wherever we had to go, and they said we couldn't go. There were a few of us, like myself,
Who had volunteered?
who had volunteered. My mother and sister were already locked up in the cattle trucks, so we just arrived there and we were told you can't go.
So just to completely clarify, the letter that had arrived for your sister had said Auschwitz is your destination?
No, I don't know. They just said, I think something like Camp to the East.
Camp to the East,
Yes,
the destination
yes,
in the East.
Yes.
And you went down to the railway platform to
the-
get
yes,
on the train
yes,
with her
yes,
and with your mother,
yes.
even though you hadn't got any such
No,
instruction.
No.
And you wanted
Because
to get
I
on.
worked in the Landwirtschaft,
Yes.
which was a protected occupation.
Yeah, so you were exempted from the
Yeah,
deportation order,
yeah.
but nevertheless you wanted to go. And I'm very, very interested in this thing about knowing and not knowing. The book I've written, The Escape Artist,
Yes.
by Rudolf Verber, it's really turns on this issue of what people knew and what they
Yeah,
didn't know.
yeah.
And you're saying in a way that you half knew what
Yes,
Auschwitz
yes,
meant,
yes,
but
yes.
also another part of your brain didn't know.
Well, didn't want to
Didn't
know.
want to know.
I think didn't want to know, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I'm interested where the information, the bit that you did know, where that would have come from.
Well, I'll tell you where it came from. At the beginning, when people arrived in Auschwitz, they had to send postcards
Yes.
to relatives who stayed behind to say how well they were doing. And people had made a kind of, beforehand they made a pact. If there are gas chambers, 2 crosses on the left of the card. If there are not gas chambers, 2 crosses on the right. Postcards arrived, crosses on the left, and people said, that's a mistake.
Right, because they didn't want
Yes,
to know.
yeah.
I didn't know about that crosses on
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
One thing
That's
I
right.
had been told, it's in my book about the letters, was the coded messages that people would send.
Mm-hmm.
They would say, do send my love to mother. And the recipient would know that their mother had died 3
Right.
years earlier.
Yeah.
And one message said, we eat every day like Yom Kippur. What was the thing? We eat every day like Yom Kippur. We work like Purim. It was some sort of coded way of saying everything is upside
Back
down.
to front, yeah.
So you went, when was it you went down to the railway platform to get on the train?
Well, it must have been the day when they were called up.
What year or month was it?
Oh, that was October 44.
Okay. So by October 44, more was beginning to be known about.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense because, the word had in some ways got out by then. Eventually, though, you did manage. I know on that day you were turned away, as it were, from the train.
On that day we were turned away at first, then in the end they found they had an extra carriage, so they allowed all the volunteers to go. But my mother and sister were already locked in their
separate cattle.
in their cattle truck. I was in a different one from them, in a much, if you see the train is like this, they were there and we were.
Because there were many, 50 or 60 of these cattle trucks. And you were relieved to get on the train. You were glad they found room for you.
I don't know whether relieved is the word, but I got on it.
Yeah, and you had wanted to get
Yeah.
Can you tell us what you remember about arriving in Auschwitz?
I remember it as if it happened yesterday. You got out of the train and you were, first of all the trains arrived in the middle of the night. You were glaring floodlights, barbed wire fences, soldiers with bayonets and dogs, and you had to go through the gate, and Mengele decided whether you were going to live or die by sending you either to the left or to the right.
And you knew it was Mengele on the day you arrived,
well,
Joseph
I'm
Mengele.
not sure that I knew it was Mengele,
No.
but subsequently I learned that it was Mengele.
So Dr. Joseph Mengele, notorious as the so-called angel of death.
That's right.
He was the head doctor.
Because,
I'm just filling in for people who don't know. The head doctor at Auschwitz.
Well, he literally decided whether you were going to live or to die.
Yes. At that point when we haven't talked about your journey. I mean, whether it was short or long, I don't know.
I think it took about 2 days, I think, from Terezin to... Auschwitz is not far from Krakow.
No. But in terrible conditions.
Well, sitting on the floor in cattle trucks with a bucket somewhere.
Yeah. No sanitation, no food or water. When you get off the train, you've told us you saw... You didn't know he was Joseph Mengele, but the chief doctor presiding over this selection, who will live and who will die. Had you seen your mother and sister at that point?
No. Because they were...
Further along, as it were.
They had already gone through the gate when I got there. But when I got to this big room where all the survivors on the left were, I met up with my sister. And she, poor girl, nearly had a heart attack because she thought I was safely in Auschwitz, and suddenly,
safely in Terezin,
and suddenly there I appear. So.
But your mother was not there.
No, my mother was not there.
Did your?
My sister, actually, we were then undressed and shaved by capos. Those were prisoners who were actually having to do all these unspeakable things to other prisoners. And they almost immediately told us about gas chambers. And so, you know, they really more or less told us, look, if your mother went to the right, she went to the gas chambers. But that was all we knew.
And can you tell us what went through you at that moment? How you took this most terrible...
I think my main memory of these 3 days in Auschwitz is fear. I mean, it was, you could smell the fear there. It was really designed to maximum effect, to dehumanize you, humiliate you, and really be terrified. It was, and that's the only way I can describe it. I mean,
some survivors I've spoken to said there almost wasn't time to absorb the bereavement. I mean, they'd been told that their mother was in it. You've been told. Is that right?
You somehow sort of put it on your own side. I remember for years after the war, I had a sort of fantasy that my mother might be alive. Knowing full well she wasn't. And the fact that if I had really believed she was alive, I would have gone to all these camps, displaced persons camps, to look for her. The fact that I never did look for her meant that I knew perfectly well that she wasn't alive, but somehow, for my own survival, I had to maintain a fantasy that she was alive.
And you were with your sister?
Yes, we were together all the time, And
you've told us you went through this process by which, as you say, almost the outer trappings of humanity are taken from you. Hair, clothes. But you've mentioned 3 days.
Yes, we were there for 3 days.
You were in Auschwitz for a total of 3 days?
Yes.
Was there time in those 3 days for you to be sent to work?
Yes.
What did you do?
Well, we were sent to a camp called Öderan, which is in Saxony, not far from Chemnitz. I don't know if there's an English name for it. Not far from Dresden, about 30 kilometers from Dresden.
Nice.
Actually, I discovered later an overflow from another camp. And there were 300 Czech women and 200 Polish women in this camp. We were housed in what had been a school, I think. We were very lucky because the whole town had a central heating system. You know, these tubes where all the hot water went round. So we were never cold. And it was winter, of course, from November to April, rather October to April.
Yes.
We were in that camp. I was in what was called the Außenkommando, which meant that we were digging a ditch to lay cables from one factory to another. They were converting a cloth factory to a munitions factory. And a few of the girls, I was one of them, worked in the road with, I'm an expert with pneumatic drill and with krumpatsch. I can't think of the English word for it. Anyway, another form of implement for digging roads.
Right, like a jackhammer kind of thing.
Yes, something like that, yes. Yeah. So we actually, because we did this work, we got an extra slice of bread at midday and soup. So we did that during the time we were there. It was hard work, but at least we were out in the fresh air. And,
yes. I mean, I think because this was so late in the war, this is late 1944 at the beginning of this, I think, again, it's not perhaps widely known that Auschwitz at that point had become this sort of way station where people would arrive and then would be sent out to other camps, and you would be an example of that. There for 3 days, but then sent out to other places. It was like a holding camp. And I feel bound to ask you, but in that time when they obviously took hair and everything else, were you tattooed in that with a number?
No. And in a way I regret that I haven't got this badge of honor.
It's interesting because Ivor Pearl, the survivor I mentioned, who I interviewed a couple of months ago, also did not get tattooed. He was in Auschwitz. It's partly through circumstance. He was about to, and there was an air raid and everything. And he too said that he, on some level, regretted not having it, to the point where he even after the war contemplated getting a tattooist to put the number there. And he was ashamed of himself for saying that he had thought about it, but he said he felt the need to be acknowledged to himself almost as a survivor. And I know you were partly joking when you said badge of honor, but tell me about that feeling.
Sorry,
but say more about that feeling about not having the tattoo.
Well, I certainly didn't know it. I often wondered whether either they'd run out of ink or because it was so late in the war that they didn't bother with us. But as I say, it was only after the war that I somehow felt, it really was a badge of honor.
Yeah. In his case,
I don't know how I would have felt if they were doing it,
yes.
But it didn't happen.
No, I mean, there's an amazing moment just in one of the accounts of the Holocaust where Auschwitz inmates are talking about the tattoos, and they say, even as they're aware that these people are being murdered every day, they say, when we're out, the thing that everyone is going to obsess about are these tattoos. That's what they'll focus on, rather than the fact that all these people are being killed. And in a way, they were right. It's one of these things that is really in people's imagination. So you were there, you had that encounter that you told us, and then, as the Americans approach, you are sent once again back to Terezin.
Yes.
I mean, tell us about that.
Yeah, but before I tell you that, there was a Czech foreman. Yeah, where we were in that camp, there were French, English, and Italian prisoners of war as well. We had a sort of minimal contact because we could see them when we were going out to work. And this Czech foreman was able to give us news. He must have listened to the BBC, and he could tell us in Czech, which the German, of course, didn't understand what was happening. So he kept us a bit informed about what was happening. But I also, during that time, again, quite unusually, only one girl died in the camp. She died of tuberculosis. And I imagine that it was a Polish girl, and I imagine she must have come there already with TB.
Right.
We had to go and bury her in the Christian cemetery. So on a kind of wooden wagon, wrapped in a blanket, myself and I think one of her best friends, and the German guards who looked after us there were actually factory girls who were put into uniforms, fairly uneducated factory girls who were put into uniforms to be our guards, except for the SS woman who came from Auschwitz with us, with her capo, the Hungarian woman, who already then had long hair. We were all shaved, of course, we had no hair at all. And as we moved along the road, some English and French prisoners of war saw us, and they took off their caps and bowed, and this was, you know, it made us feel human. It was something so special. Why I'm telling you this, because when we got to the cemetery and we had to dig the grave and bury the girl, the German girl, the guard, wanted us to throw her in naked to save the blanket. And her friend, who was so religious, very religious, in fact, some of the Polish girls were so religious that the bits of meat that were in the soup they would take out, they wouldn't eat it.
So when you're saying Polish Jewish?
Polish Jewish girls,
Yes.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. She argued with that German guard, I don't know for how long. She would have allowed herself to be killed rather than let her, then throw her in without being wrapped in the blanket. In the end, she won, and we buried her in the blanket.
That's an amazing story.
Yes.
So this teenage girl was able to prevail over
Yes,
the SS
yes,
German
yeah,
woman in
yeah,
charge
yeah,
by
yeah,
arguing
yeah,
with her.
yeah. I mean, that made me kind of realize what the strength of feeling if you're really religious.
Yes.
I don't think I would have done it. But
No.
I mean, I might have done it for other reasons, but not for religious reasons.
And again, the scene here is that you are prisoners. Again, the striped uniforms that you are...
No, we didn't have striped uniforms. We had sort of blue overall things. Yeah.
So as I said, that at this point, the Americans are approaching, or
Yes.
the Allies are approaching,
Yes, yes.
and there is some degree of panic among the Germans. They know what's happening. They send you back to Terezin.
That's
and
right.
And there, as I understand it, you work in an orphanage with children who'd only ever been in Terezin.
No, that was
Okay.
subsequently, yes. We were taken back to Terezin, and then that was, I think, end of April, and on the 8th of May we were liberated when the Russians moved on to Prague. On the way to Prague, we were liberated by the Russian army. And again, I must say, I mean, there were all the surviving prisoners from all other camps were all being sent back to Terezin, and half of them, many of them were half starved, half dead, and quite a few dead bodies among them. And they came there with typhus. And something one can say about things like a communist regime, they immediately installed a quarantine. They quarantined all the typhus patients so that, in fact, they saved a lot of lives. So that, I'm just pointing that out.
Because Terezin at that point is used almost as a sort of dumping ground of people
Right,
from
yes,
all these
yeah,
different
yeah,
camps
yeah,
who've come
yeah,
back.
yeah.
But I want to get to this place where at one point you're 16 years old and you're working, in effect, with some of these very
Yes,
traumatized children.
when we left Terezin, somebody, I can't remember now whether perhaps in Terezin already somebody told me that he was a Czech brethren, a very kind of humanitarian man. He commandeered a lorry and collected all the orphans. I mean, they literally, the small children under 5, there were about 6 or 10 of them. And he commandeered a German villa and installed these children in that villa. And I went there as a kind of to look after these children as a sort of helper.
And Czech Brethren is like a Christian sect.
Yes,
yeah.
It's a Christian sect.
And so
yes.
you were there as a helper, and it's an amazing thought, this, because you're just 16.
Mm-hmm.
You are yourself without a mother then, and yet you are sort of mothering these children.
Yeah, that's right.
I want to hear you say more about that.
Well, I tell you what was, these children had never had any other life than in Terezin, so they didn't know about normal life. And there was a radio, and they suddenly heard voices coming out of this box. So they ran around the other room to see where the people are who are talking. They had no idea what a radio was. I mean, they literally was. I mean, it was that level of deprivation.
Because they'd either been in Terezin or in other camps.
No, only in Terezin.
Only in
I
Terezin.
think they were all people from...
The thing I was thinking about was something you had said in a previous interview, that you said mothering children is sort of mothering yourself.
Yes. I mean, it's something that I came to understand about myself later, how much mothering other children can be a way of mothering yourself.
And so in that period, were you sort of mothering yourself, looking after yourself?
I imagine so, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I hadn't thought of it then.
Because that, to me, you know, the idea of you looking for a sort of surrogate mother, I would understand, but the idea that you would find it in yourself by mothering these other children is very striking to me. You then did make your path to London.
Yes.
And partly to be, and in a way we haven't mentioned him since much earlier in the story, but to be reunited with your father. Your father did make it to London, having, you know, earlier on when you were stranded there in Poland, he had tried to get to London, but he had actually made it.
No, he got to London.
Yes, he did.
He knew he was in London
Yes.
during the war, yes.
And so you made your route there. Now, what was that reunion like for
Well,
you?
there was also very strange, but there were newspapers with lists and lists of people looking for each other. So that's how we found each other, because of course we didn't know where he lived in England.
Yeah.
And my sister and I were the only survivors of his whole family, his parents, his 5 sisters, his wife, all perished. So he really had something of a nervous breakdown. I mean, he was quite a broken man. When I got to something that kept me sort of going in Öderan was a fantasy that my father was became very wealthy in England, and he'll make up all the things that I had missed. Well, the reality turned out to be somewhat different to what I imagined, and in fact he was really a totally broken man.
Apparently your microphone needs to come a little nearer to you. But yeah, why don't you help out while I just ask something else? I mean, I'm just wondering there how, you know, you're a teenager.
Yes.
You're without a mother.
Yeah.
You're reunited with your father, who in some ways is sort of a broken man.
Yes.
I mean, how you coped with that?
Not very well. I coped with it by finding a school and enrolling myself in an English school. Because the thing that I also felt so deprived of was education. I had missed 4 years of schooling.
Right.
So when we moved to Kilburn, I happened to see lots of girls walking about with sort of school hats, So I walked around the corner and there was a school. And I walked into the school. It happened to be I didn't know it happened to be the day before term started. And the only person who was there was the secretary. So I just said to her, look, I'd like to come and enroll in the school. She said, come back tomorrow. And tomorrow I went back and all the teachers sort of tried to find out what I knew and what I didn't know in order to send me into the right class. And I think that really helped me to be back in a sort of somewhat normal environment like it's called.
And you would have had only very little English at that point.
Well, I came in August, and that was in January. By then I had picked up quite a bit of English, yes.
You then go on after school, you train in psychotherapy with Anna Freud,
yes,
who we mentioned a long time ago, earlier in our conversation. There's a whole lot of questions I want to ask you about that, but I'm aware of time and I do want to bring in other people and hear their questions, because you were, training as an analyst and there were these wars going on between Anna Freud and Melanie Klein and two different schools about child psychotherapy and so on.
The wars were not actually between Melanie Klein and Anna, but between her adherents, as it were.
Yes.
We had a Hungarian lecturer whose name was Lantos. I can't remember now what she lectured in, but she really drip-fed us poison about Melanie. She hated her with all her guts. Because she was part of the controversial discussions when this whole thing blew up, when the Freuds arrived after just before the war and upset Melanie Klein's kingdom.
Yeah.
And it really was, yes.
So there may be questions all of you have got about the sort of child psychotherapy, civil wars,
but
which
the two schools were sort of literally rode apart.
Yeah.
We were in Merchant Garden and the Tavistock was in Belsize Avenue, but never the twain did meet.
Yes, no, it's wonderful. And Klein versus Freud in North London, it is obviously epic conflict. But I want to just ask you things of my own before we broaden out, about standing back from the whole story. The first one is Daniel Finkelstein has a book out now about his parents' stories, both very interesting. One a survivor of the Holocaust who was in Belsen, another one who's a survivor of Soviet persecution, was in the Gulag. It's a very, very powerful story. But I spoke to him about the book and put to him the notion of sort of inherited trauma and second-generation trauma. He as the child of survivors. And he said that his own mother was very dismissive of this idea, that she didn't believe in so-called second-generation survivors, and that she had herself made a new life, and that was that. And I'm keen to put the question to you, both as somebody who lived through this yourself, but also as an expert in the field, whether this notion of the child who did not directly go through this can nevertheless inherit some of the trauma.
And how, particularly when it's unconscious and can't be talked about. If anybody is interested in this, I can highly recommend Anne Karp's story, The War and After, because she was the daughter of two survivors who never ever talked about their experiences, but unconsciously transmitted the trauma to her in the way that they related to her and they behaved to her. And there is also a beautiful book, I'm just trying, If This Sea Under Love, I can't remember.
David Grossman.
David Grossman. He also, the first part of the book is a description of how you experience something that can't be talked about.
Yes.
Yeah.
On this point about talking about it, I'm not sure I may just not know about it, but you have described yourself enrolling in a school and learning about psychotherapy and becoming a practitioner in this field in a 60-year-long or longer career. Were you ever a recipient of psychotherapy in the
Oh, of course. Yes,
as part of the training. Yeah.
As part of the training, I had to undergo analysis myself. And in fact, the reason that I'm able to talk to you like I do today is because I was able to process it and work through these traumas. And I was in one of those BBC films with a lot of other survivors, and when I watched it, what struck me was that people who didn't have a chance to process it with somebody else in a safe environment still lived with it. They were still in the camp, and they were still they were still there.
They were still prisoners.
Yes, they were still prisoners in their own minds.
Because what you've said there fits absolutely with my experience of speaking with people about this, that almost all of them did not have any counselling or therapy. And in fact, one said that he'd been offered it recently. You know, he's a man in his 80s or 90s, and he'd had it in recent years, but never in the immediate aftermath, in the 1940s or 50s.
Right, yes.
And that, it now strikes me, maybe this explains your answer to my very first question, when I asked you, are you dreading talking about it?
No.
And you said not at all.
No.
Whereas other survivors do, and maybe it's for the reason you've just explained.
My sister was never able to talk about it.
Now, why was that?
Because she didn't have what I had, an analysis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because she didn't take that path that you took to become a journalist.
No.
And then maybe this will be the last one of mine, and then I want to let people come in with theirs. I'm interested in this notion of you seeing child patients who, I think it's fair to say, almost whatever they had gone through could not really compare with somebody who had been in Terezin and in Auschwitz and so on. And whether that would be a sort of gap between you and them. I've got in my mind, I'll come directly to what's in my mind. I've written about this before, the book Mouse by Art Spiegelman, about being the son of a survivor, which I think is a masterpiece, graphic novel. The opening scene is him as a child who has been bullied at school. He runs home to tell his Holocaust survivor father, and his father says, when you're locked in a cellar with no food or drink, then you'll find out what is friends. You know? In other words, you've suffered nothing. Yeah. There you are sitting with people for 60, 70 years who are telling you terrible problems about their lives, and I'm interested to know what happens to the voice in you that thinks, I've had it worse than this.
No, it doesn't. You don't. You listen to their story, and your story doesn't come into it. Yeah. You know, their trauma is their trauma, and you have to accept that they experience something as a trauma.
Thank you. Yeah. I've got many more things I would love to ask, but I'm sure people do here. Look, lots of hands already. Why don't we, just because I can see someone, no, please do. Let's go to the lady here. Keep your hand up. Depending on what the questions are, no, oh, sorry, I meant you, but she went over there, sorry. We'll go to your question first, then you, I'll take two or three in a little group. So let's hear your question. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Dobrý den. I'm very pleased to have heard you.
And can you speak up?
Oh, right.
I can't hear you.
Oh, right. Dobrý den. I wanted to say how very moving I found your story. My parents were in Terezin. My parents were there for 3 years before they were sent to Auschwitz. And my father was sent first, and my mother, like you, she volunteered the next day, but she never saw him again. You know, every survivor's story is unique and different, although they might have common elements. But also, I wanted to ask you whether you ever came across in Terezin and Auschwitz Freddie Hirsch.
Freddie Hirsch, I knew of him. He was mainly involved with working with the boys in Terezin. Of course, in Auschwitz, I didn't, as I say, I was there for 3 days, so I didn't meet anybody. But I knew of him in Terezin. He was a very well-known and much loved person. Yes.
And I understand you also knew or know Helga Hoshkova-Weissova.
Yes, yes, I know her daughter she's unfortunately died. She was a therapist in Prague, and I knew her through my profession. That's how I got to know her mother. I've got her book, Zeichne, was du siehst.
Yes.
Draw what you see.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful book about. What is so striking is the naive, childlike pictures from Terezin and then after Auschwitz. The contrast is extraordinary.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's take the microphone over there. The story of Freddie Hirsch is an extraordinary story. People are familiar with it. He was a youth leader who became and carried on being a leader in the Czech family camp, which was an extraordinary camp within Auschwitz where families were kept together, again for the same function that Lydia was explaining about Terezin, to be a kind of showpiece, to show off to any visiting Red Cross. Red Cross were offered and never took up the offer to go to Auschwitz. They never saw it. It's a whole other story. It's also mentioned in The Escape Artist, which I've mentioned already too many times. Yes?
Good afternoon. I want to thank you very much for speaking with us. And I'm honored to be here from the United States. I'm the sister of one of the performers, Miriam Kramer. I'm married to a second-generation survivor, my husband, Larry Cohen. I just wanted to ask you again for the name of the 2 books that you mentioned, please, if you wouldn't mind.
Anne Karpf, The War and After.
The War and After.
And the other one was Sea Under Love
By David Grossman.
by David Grossman. He lives in Israel.
In Israel, okay, yes. Thank you very much.
So Anne Karpf and David Grossman are the authors you
There's
need to look out.
hands up.
Okay, we'll have a question here and then we'll come to you. Yeah.
Have I?
Sorry. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Lydia. Thank you so much for speaking. I'm just curious about the hope. The issue of hope. During the times you were at Terezin and at Auschwitz, or where all the camps you were at, did the people imagine that at some point their predicament will come to an end? Were there conversations about when this comes to an end, this is what we'll do afterwards? Did people actually know it will come to an end? Beyond fantasizing and dreaming, was there a certainty that, you know what, this is going to come to an end someday? Or did they imagine it might just go on endlessly? I'm just curious about the kind of conversations and thoughts and feelings people had about the length of time they would go through what they were going through and what would happen afterwards. And were there people, even if we were to go a bit supernatural, who even had visions of the future, dreams of a life beyond this and what will happen afterwards?
Just before you answer, let's get the microphone to the gentleman there who's been waiting, so we're all ready with the next question. Keep your hand up if you would. Yeah, Lydia. About hope.
The hope, well, I think the hope was that the war will come to an end. That's in a way what kept. If you give up hope, I think you give up life. So you do have to go on hoping that the thing will come to an end sometime. If you were lucky enough to get some information, as we did, for instance, from this Czech man, you had some idea that things were getting towards the end. But without hope, I think you can't survive.
That's a profound thought. Question there.
Lydia, you spoke about the German military and your experience.
Yes.
And I've been wondering, since the end of the war and in your life,
Yes.
have you been to Germany, and how you feel about Germany, or have felt in these years, knowing what a large Jewish presence there now is in Berlin?
It took me a long time before I could even contemplate going to Germany and speak German or hear German spoken. I actually, in 1955, I went back to Czechoslovakia for the first time, and I went by train through Germany. It wasn't too bad an experience. The people behaved so decently. Actually, I remember when we were in Germany with my husband, we were hoping to find somebody we could criticize for being German, and they behaved so impeccably that we couldn't find anything to criticize them for. And I did actually the church in Öderan, somebody from the church in Öderan managed to get in contact with us, and they invited us back to Öderan. We went there, some of us went to visit Öderan, and we were giving a talk to the general public, and a man piped up and said, "I remember seeing you working in the street, and now I know who it was." He said, "I went to my mother and asked," he was about 8 years older at the time, "I remember going to my mother and asking who these women were. I can't remember what she told him."
Are there, yes, still lots of questions. Why don't we bring the microphone just here, because it's, if you keep your hand up, there we are. Welcome to you next. Yeah.
Oh, first of all, Lydia, thank you for showing everybody your resilience. I think everyone's very lucky and privileged to see how strong you are. I'd like you both to make a reflection. Recently, I've heard both of you in different contexts, you talking about your book, The Escape Artist, and Lydia attending lots of lectures about refugee children in Britain. And I'd like you both to reflect on what can be done, not in terms of psychoanalytic defenses or people's political views, but how can we get people to see the truth about what is going on and the parallels, some parallels, between what was going on in Europe in the 40s and what's going on now in Britain, in terms of what you mentioned, Lydia, a couple of weeks ago about the hostile environment that we're in now. And why, Jonathan, why people didn't believe Verba. Those are the parallels.
Well, I suppose the only way I can answer it is when on the few occasions when I've been asked to go and talk to schools, I always make it a point to relate my experience to the present, and I feel that's the only reason why I do it. And what I always point out is the danger of projection, that the way we deal with unwanted feelings, we project them into others, and then we become them and us, and that is something that we have to take. We have to take responsibility for our own hostile feelings and aggressive feelings, acknowledge them but not act on them. That's the best I can do.
That's pretty good. Thank you. I mean, my thought on this is that the parallel I see is between the British government's policy on refugees now and the British government's closed door to refugees would-be refugees from Germany in the 1930s and 40s. That, to me, is where the parallel lies, not with particularly Germany's treatment of Jews, which I think is very different, but the way that Britain wanted to close the door to refugees then and closes the door to refugees now. And I've written a bit about this, so you may have heard me say this before, but Britain loves congratulating itself about the Kindertransport, and the clue is in the name. Britain took in 9,000 children because it didn't want their parents. And in fact, it forced the most traumatic scenes of family separation, where parents had to give up their children with no idea where the children were going and whether they would ever see them again, because Britain said no to their parents. And so that's where I see a parallel. And in fact, many of the same newspapers that are hostile to migrants now were hostile to people like Lydia then. I mean, Jewish refugees in need. So that's the parallel I would see. I just your point about anger, and that that just prompts something which I've often wondered about, and it was something Rudolf Werber wrestled with, the man I wrote about, which is that he was a very angry survivor. And when he would speak on platforms like this, and eventually he stopped getting invited, he would be very full of rage about the way the world had treated him and his fellow Jews, and not had listened to the warnings and so on. And the invitations dried up in a way because people didn't want to hear that from a survivor. And I just want to hear from you, and Anthony will signal if this needs to be the last question. I think unfortunately for people who had their hands up, this will be the last question. About us, how we treat survivors, Holocaust survivors, whether we as a society and as a Jewish community treat them the way they should be treated. In his case, there was no room, people didn't want to hear anything other than a sort of optimistic message that in the end life is good, and they didn't really leave room for victims of terrible trauma to be angry. Wearing both your hats, as a survivor and as a psychotherapist, what are we getting wrong and what are we getting right in the way, as a community, we treat and listen to, or not, survivors of the Holocaust?
I think it depends very much on the individual, to what extent people are ready and able to take in other people's suffering. I think the reason people kind of turn away is because they can't tolerate, they can't bear to hear these inhuman stories. So they have to cut off. And they say, go away, I don't want to know about it. It's, I think, certainly there is a culture, and at the moment it's a very hostile one, and Suella Braverman has a lot to answer for. But it does depend on one's capacity to accept other people's pain.
It's been a very enlightening conversation for me. I'm sure everyone here too will want to join me in thanking our speaker today for hearing some really compelling wisdom and testimony. A warm round of applause and gratitude to Lydia Tischler. Thank you, Lydia, very much. Thank you.